This is Atlas, broadcasting from Station Zebra. If you're hearing this, you're still out there, still listening, still surviving. That's all that matters. It's night, I think. The kind of night that doesn't feel like it has a beginning or an end, just a stretch of empty hours bleeding into one another. If I had to guess, it's been a while since my last transmission. Longer than I intended. Time has been unreliable. But I'm here now, and I have things to tell you. The world is changing again. I don't mean the war, the fallout, the invaders. I don't mean the things we can see. Crumbling buildings, burning skies, the ghosts of the old world scattering in the wind. I mean the fabric of reality itself. It's unraveling piece by piece, folding in on itself like something vast and unseen is rewriting the rules as we go. I've been moving between the dead zones, trying to keep the signal strong, trying to stay ahead of whatever's closing in. It isn't just destruction anymore. The things we took for granted, landmarks, roads, even the passage of time, they don't hold together like they used to. What was familiar yesterday might not be there tomorrow, and if it is, it may not be the same. I walked into a town 3 nights ago, or at least I think it was 3 nights. The place was untouched. No bomb craters, no fire damage, no collapsed structures. Just rows of buildings standing perfectly still, waiting. It looked like people had just stepped out for a moment, like they were about to return at any second. The doors were open. The street lights were still glowing, their faint hum the only sound. Cars sat abandoned mid-turn, the keys still in the ignition. A half-eaten meal sat on a diner table, a fork resting on a plate as if someone had only just set it down. But there was no one. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Not even dust. That was the part that unsettled me the most. The air smelled clean, too clean. The whole town was preserved, frozen in time, waiting for something that would never come. I checked a few buildings, walked through a gas station, a motel, an old bookstore with shelves still lined with titles that hadn't been touched in years. That's when I noticed it. The silence wasn't just an absence of people, it was deliberate. It was a silence that felt placed there, like something had hollowed the town out from the inside and left nothing behind. Then I saw my reflection. It was in a store window, just a passing glance. At first, it seemed normal. Just me, standing in the dim glow of the streetlights. The same tired face I've been carrying for too long now. But when I moved, it didn't. Not right away. It was a fraction of a second behind, just enough for my brain to register that something was wrong. I turned my head, followed too late. I lifted my arm. It mirrored me, but its fingers twitched at the wrong moment, the motion stuttering like a glitch in reality. I took a step back. It hesitated. Then it smiled. I didn't. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in that moment, staring at a version of myself that shouldn't exist. My pulse hammered in my ears, a rush of cold crawling up my spine. Then, just as suddenly as it had faltered, the reflection corrected itself, perfectly in sync. Just my face, my expression, my movements. Nothing out of place. I left. I walked fast, not running, not looking back, just putting as much distance between myself and that place as I could. By the time I reached the outskirts, the streetlights had started flickering, their glow dimming one by one as if something was closing its grip around the town. The air grew heavier, pressing down like a weight I couldn't shake. And when I finally turned to steal one last glance, the town was gone. Not destroyed, not abandoned, just gone. The buildings, the roads, the perfectly arranged remains of a place that shouldn't have been empty. It had all vanished, replaced by an expanse of smooth, undisturbed earth. No rubble, no foundation, no sign that anything had ever been there at all. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, that exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. The world is hollowing itself out. Places are being rewritten, replaced by something that only looks real on the surface. And if you stay too long, if you let it notice you, if you let it hold on to you, I don't think it lets you leave. There's something wrong with the ruins. The ones left standing, the ones half buried in dust and broken glass, the ones that should be nothing more than hollowed out shells. Some of them aren't empty. Some of them aren't dead. I was moving through what used to be a train station, the kind built back when people still believed in permanence, in solid foundations, in things that would outlast them. The walls were cracked but still upright, the floor covered in shattered tile and the remains of benches that had once lined the waiting area. A rusted-out schedule board hung from the ceiling, frozen on the last departures that would never happen. First, it was just another ruin, a place to rest, to check the signal, to decide where I was heading next. I wasn't planning on staying long, just long enough to gather my bearings. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was thick, not dusty, not musty, not the stagnant scent of a place long abandoned. Thick in a way that pressed down against my skin, in a way that filled the space between my ribs, in a way that made the ground itself feel unsteady beneath my feet. I thought it was my imagination. I told myself it was just exhaustion, just the weight of too many nights without sleep, too many days moving without pause. But then the walls moved. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't wind shifting through broken windows or the settling groan of old stone. The walls inhaled. I saw the cracks in the ceiling expand, stretching wide like ribs pulling apart to take in breath. The floor beneath me shifted, the dust trembling, the air itself vibrating with something that wasn't natural. I froze. It was slow, almost unnoticeable at first, the way the entire structure seemed to expand, to make space, to welcome something unseen. I held my breath, listening, feeling the way the silence changed, the way it wasn't silence at all. There was a sound beneath it, something deep, something distant, something that echoed inside the walls like a heartbeat inside a chest. I took a step back. The ground flexed beneath my boot, not solid, not stable. The station exhaled. It wasn't a gust of wind, wasn't a collapse of debris. It was a sigh, low and deep and steady, moving through the bones of the ruin like something enormous had just noticed me. I turned and left. I didn't run, but I didn't hesitate, didn't stop to look back, didn't stay to see what would happen if I lingered any longer. The moment I crossed the threshold, the weight lifted, the air thinned, the pressure eased, the silence returned to what silence should be. I stood outside for a long time, watching, waiting, listening. But the station didn't move again. It didn't have to. I kept walking. The next day, I passed through another ruin. A house this time, or what was left of one. The frame had collapsed inward, leaving only half-standing walls and the remnants of a second floor that no longer had anything to hold it up. I didn't go inside, but I saw it happen. The walls shifted, the broken beams twisted, the wood curling in on itself, the jagged edges smoothing over as if the house was trying to heal. I stood there, watching as the ruin put itself back together, as the gaps filled in, as the place reshaped itself into something new, something whole, something that had never been broken at all. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The structure remained, no longer collapsed, no longer a ruin, but something else entirely, something unfamiliar. I walked away before it noticed me. The ruins are breathing. They are watching. They are rebuilding themselves in ways that don't make sense, in ways that have nothing to do with time or decay or repair. They are changing, shifting, becoming something other than what they were. And I don't think they're doing it on their own. The airwaves haven't been clean for a long time. The old stations, the ones that used to carry news, music, voices from the world we lost. Most of them are gone, wiped away in the first waves of destruction. But something else has filled the space they left behind. I've been listening, trying to piece together whatever scraps of information I can, trying to hear if there's anyone still out there. But the longer I listen, the less sure I am that what I'm hearing is human. It started a few nights ago. I was scanning frequencies, running through static, through the remnants of lost broadcasts, through the silence left behind when the old world fell apart. Then, in between the empty signals, I heard a voice, faint, broken, cutting in and out like it was fighting through interference. "Please, I'm stuck. I don't know where I am. If you can hear me, please." Then static, then silence. Sounded real, desperate, like someone out there was trying to reach anyone who could listen. But something about it was off. The tone, the rhythm. It was too even, too measured. as if the words had been carefully placed rather than spoken in fear. I waited. A minute passed, maybe two. Then the voice came again. "Please, I'm stuck. I don't know where I am. If you can hear me, please." The same words, the same breaks in the signal, the same desperation. It wasn't a distress call. It was a recording. I let it play again, this time listening carefully, trying to catch anything beneath the static, anything that might give me a clue about where it was coming from. And that's when I heard it. Something layered underneath the voice. A whisper, just beneath the words. Faint, nearly imperceptible. Not in English, not in any language I recognized. I cut the frequency, but it wasn't the last time I heard it. The next day, it came back. Same voice, same plea, same loop. But this time, something changed. Said my name. "Atlas. Please, I'm stuck. I don't know where I am." The breath left my lungs. My fingers hovered over the dial, frozen. The voice was the same, but the inflection was different. More precise, more knowing. I didn't respond. I didn't let it play again. I don't know where these voices are coming from, and I don't know who or what is sending them. But I do know this. They aren't reaching out for help. They're reaching out for something else. A few nights later, I picked up another transmission. This one wasn't a distress call. It was just breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate. It lasted for 30 seconds before cutting off. I haven't been scanning the frequencies as much since then. There's something in the wires, in the airwaves, in the spaces where human voices used to be. It's listening, it's learning, and now it knows my name. The sky isn't what it used to be. It hasn't been for a while. We've all seen it, how it shifts, how it flickers, how the stars don't hold their places anymore. But this isn't just about lights moving where they shouldn't. The sky itself is breaking. I met a traveler from Zone G7. She looked hollow, eyes sunken. Her voice thin and strained, like she had spent too long holding her breath. She told me she had been keeping north, following the same stretch of open land she'd walked dozens of times before. But something had changed. When she looked up, she saw it. A crack. Not a cloud. Not a strange formation in the atmosphere. Not another one of the flickering anomalies we've learned to ignore. A gap in the sky. She said it looked like the world had torn open. A jagged fracture running through the heavens. Blacker than night. Deeper than the void of space itself. The edges shimmered, rippling like fabric caught in a slow-moving current. And beyond it, something moved. She didn't stay to watch. I didn't believe her at first. We've all seen things that don't make sense. Illusions cast by exhaustion, hallucinations born from sleepless nights and too many days spent navigating a world that refuses to stay in place. But then I saw it myself. It wasn't where she said it had been. It was further west, over the remains of what used to be an industrial zone. A perfect, gaping hole where the sky should have been, stretching wide, swallowing starlight, devouring the clouds around it. It wasn't empty. Something was on the other side. I couldn't see it fully, only glimpses through the shifting edges, long, coiling shapes, moving with a slow, deliberate purpose, like something vast and unknowable pressing against the thin membrane of what separates us from whatever exists beyond. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Not like it had sealed itself, not like it had closed up and healed, just gone. Like the sky had never been broken at all. I stood there for a long time, staring, waiting, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined it. But I know what I saw, and I wasn't the only one. Others have reported the same thing. Fractures appearing in random locations, lingering for minutes, sometimes hours, before disappearing without a trace. Some who stare too long say they hear something. A distant hum, a low vibration, something deep and resonant, like a voice speaking words too massive for human understanding. Some of them don't look away in time. I met a man who spent a full hour watching one of these cracks, memorizing every shift in its shape, every pattern in the way the light warped around it. He didn't speak when I found him, just stood there, blinking slowly, his pupils wide and unfocused. When I finally got him to talk, he said the same sentence over and over. "It's not supposed to be seen." He couldn't tell me what he meant. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he did and just couldn't explain it. The sky is failing. The gaps are growing. The fractures don't stay in one place, don't follow any pattern we can track. Some last seconds, others linger like open wounds in the fabric of reality. But whatever's behind them, whatever's waiting on the other side, it's watching. And I think it's getting closer. The roads don't work the way they used to. Maybe you've noticed. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you've been lucky enough to only travel the ones that still follow logic, the ones that still take you where you expect to go. But those roads are disappearing, and the ones that remain are twisting into something else. I was following a stretch of highway, a path I knew well. I'd walked it before, mapped out the turns, marked the old signs that had somehow survived the fire and collapse. The kind of road that should have been predictable. But predictability doesn't exist anymore. I walked for hours, the same cracked pavement beneath my feet, the same rusted out cars lining the edges like forgotten corpses. At some point, I noticed the sun hadn't moved. The sky had shifted colors, bleeding into that sickly yellow haze that lingers too long before dusk. But the sun itself hadn't changed position. It was still there, hanging heavy and unmoving, locked in place like time had forgotten to pull it along. That's when I realized I was still passing the same landmarks, the same burned-out gas station, the same overturned truck with its cargo spilled across the road in a scatter of unrecognizable metal, the same broken fence leaning toward the highway, its wires tangled like reaching fingers. I stopped walking. I turned around. The road behind me looked no different than the road ahead. I picked a direction and walked faster. 30 minutes passed, then an hour, then 2. The landmarks never changed. The same gas station, the same truck, the same broken fence, repeating themselves like a looped recording of a world that no longer made sense. I left the road, cut through the trees, took a path that shouldn't have been there, took me somewhere new, but I don't think it was a place I was supposed to find. Others have told me the same stories. Roads that lead nowhere, paths that double back on themselves, travelers who set out toward a known destination only to find themselves hours later exactly where they started, no matter how far they walked. Some say they've seen themselves ahead on the road, just out of reach, always too far to catch up. No one knows what happens if you do. A group of survivors tried to outsmart it, set markers, kept watch on every step they took. They traveled in shifts, making sure at least one person was always awake, always aware, never letting their surroundings slip out of focus. It didn't matter. The road still led them in circles. They slept in shifts just in case. When one of them woke up, they found themselves standing at the edge of their own camp, watching. They didn't stay to see what happened next. Some roads still work. Some paths still follow the rules. But the longer this goes on, the more the world reshapes itself into something unfamiliar, the harder it becomes to trust them. If you find yourself walking a road that feels wrong, a path that never ends, a stretch of land that refuses to let you leave, turn back before it notices you. If it hasn't already, the places we knew are vanishing, not in the way cities crumble, not in the way nature reclaims ruins, not in the slow decay of time. They are disappearing completely, erased from existence without a trace, like someone is redrawing the map in real time. Started with small things. A house a survivor swore was there yesterday, now nothing but flat, undisturbed ground. A bridge that had been used for months, standing solid and unbroken, suddenly gone, leaving only the chasm beneath. At first, we thought it was the invaders, something they were doing, some method of dismantling the world piece by piece. But I don't think this is their work. I passed through a settlement 2 weeks ago, a real one, built up over time, fortified, secure. Survivors had lived there for months, reinforced their walls, scavenged supplies, made a home out of the wreckage of everything that came before. I stayed for a night, traded information, checked my maps, prepared to keep moving. When I returned 3 days later, the entire place was gone. Not destroyed, not burned, not abandoned, just gone. The buildings, the barricades, the makeshift gardens carved into the dirt erased. No rubble, no broken beams, no scattered remains of the people who had lived there. The land was smooth, untouched, like nothing had ever been built there at all. The only thing left behind was a single chair, sitting in the middle of the open space where the main hall used to be. It was perfectly clean, no dust, no sign of weathering, as if it had just been placed there. It was still warm. I don't know what's causing this. I don't know if these places are being taken, or if reality itself is folding them inward, erasing them from existence like mistakes on a page. But it's happening more often. More survivors are reporting locations vanishing overnight, camps they had planned to return to, supply caches they had marked, whole streets in the ruins of the old cities just ceasing to be. Some of them come back, but when they do, they aren't the same. A man told me about a warehouse his group had used as a safe house. It disappeared one night just like all the others. Then, 2 weeks later, it was there again, standing in the exact same spot, as if it had never been gone. But the doors were different. The windows were in the wrong places. The inside was too large, stretching deeper than the building should have allowed. They didn't go inside. Someone else did. A traveler, desperate for shelter, too tired to care about the warnings. He walked through the door. The others waited outside. He never came out. The next day, the warehouse was gone again. The landmarks are shifting. The world is rewriting itself. I don't know if there's a pattern, if certain places are more at risk, if this is happening everywhere or only in the places we notice. But if you're keeping track of your surroundings, if you're marking your maps, be careful. Because the places you think you know might not be there tomorrow, and the ones that return might not want you to leave. There are people on the roads, or at least they look like people. You've probably seen them by now, standing far off, watching from the edges of highways, just beyond the broken skyline of dead cities, lingering at the farthest point your eyes can reach. They never move. I noticed them a few weeks back. The first time, I barely paid attention. Just a shape on the horizon, unmoving, silhouetted against the ruins. At that distance, it was easy to mistake for debris, a broken signpost, a collapsed power line, something left behind in the wreckage of the old world. But it wasn't. I kept walking, keeping to the edges of the cracked pavement, listening for anything unusual. After an hour, I glanced back over my shoulder. The figure was still there. Same distance, same position. I kept moving. Another hour passed. I looked again. Still there. It wasn't following me. Not in the way something with legs and lungs and the need to breathe would. But every time I stopped to rest, every time I slowed my pace and turned to check my surroundings, it was exactly where it had been before. No closer, no farther, just standing there, waiting. I didn't approach. I don't think I could have if I tried. Others have told me the same story. Travelers walking the long stretches between outposts, survivors moving through the wreckage of the world, all reporting the same thing. Figures in the distance, always alone, always still, never responding. Some tried to close the gap. It didn't work. No matter how many steps they took, no matter how fast they moved, the distance never changed. They couldn't reach it. One group decided to test it. 5 of them. They picked a figure at the far edge of an empty street, just past the remains of an old supermarket. It had been standing there for hours, perfectly motionless. They split up, approached from multiple angles, making sure to watch it at all times. Then, for just a second, one of them blinked. When his eyes opened, the figure was standing right in front of him. He screamed. The others ran. They found him a day later, wandering in a daze, mumbling under his breath, unable to explain what had happened in the space between his blink and the moment they fled. The figure was gone. No one knows what they are. Some think they're remnants of the people who vanished when the war started, shadows of those erased when the invaders rewrote the world in their own image. Others think there's something new, something waiting for the right moment to move, to act, to reach the rest of us. A few survivors swear they've seen familiar faces among them, people they used to know, people who should be dead. If you see one, don't approach. Don't try to reach it. Don't let it catch you blinking, because if it does, you might not be the same when you open your eyes. The machines are still running. Not all of them. Not the ones we built to last, the ones we relied on, the ones we thought would outlive us. Those are mostly dead, drained, rusted, gutted by time and neglect. The power grids are gone. The satellites have long since fallen silent. But there are still things out there humming, still screens flickering, still signals broadcasting something we were never meant to hear. I came across an old convenience store a few days ago, one of the small ones, the kind meant for quick stops and forgettable purchases. The doors were broken, the shelves mostly empty, nothing worth taking. But as I walked past the refrigerators lining the back wall, I heard it. A low, rhythmic hum. One of the machines was still on. There was no power, no generator, no working grid, no reason for it to be running. But the light inside was flickering, a dull, pulsing glow stretching across the cracked glass. I stepped closer. The hum grew louder. I reached for the door, hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside, the shelves were bare, nothing but dust and the lingering scent of something long since rotted away. But the light inside was still pulsing. Then, just as I was about to step back, the glass behind me reflected something that wasn't there. Not my face, not the ruined store, something else. A shape shifting, watching. I shut the door. The light went out. The hum stopped. It wasn't the first time. Survivors have told me about vending machines still glowing in the ruins of buildings that should have collapsed years ago. About ATMs flashing error messages even when the banks they belonged to no longer existed. About gas station pumps whispering static when there's no wind to carry sound. A man I met on the road said he stopped at an old payphone in a town that shouldn't have had working lines. He lifted the receiver, expecting nothing. First, there was silence, then breathing, slow, shallow, like someone on the other end was listening, waiting for him to speak first. He set the phone down and walked away. But as he left, the receiver lifted on its own. And then there are the televisions. I found a set of them, stacked high in the remains of an electronics store. Most of the screens shattered. Glass cracked, dust settled deep in the wiring. But one of them still worked, turned on by itself. No static, no freaky, just a perfect image of the street outside, the exact place I had been standing minutes before I entered the store. There was someone in the image, person, facing the camera, dressed like me, but they weren't me. I turned. The street outside was empty. When I looked back at the screen, the figure was closer. I didn't stay to see what happened when they reached the glass. Some of these machines were never supposed to turn back on. Some of them aren't running on power we understand. They are still transmitting, still showing things, still trying to be seen. And some of them are watching back. Shelter doesn't mean safety anymore. The walls, the roofs, the concrete barriers we used to rely on, some of them are turning against us. Some of them are no longer just places. I stayed in an abandoned office building 2 nights ago. It was mostly intact, the kind of place that had once been filled with desk workers and the hum of artificial lighting. Now, it was just another husk of a world that doesn't exist anymore. It should have been safe. The doors locked. The walls were thick enough to muffle the wind, to keep the sounds of the outside world at bay. But sometime during the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. The air was still. The room was just as I had left it. But something felt off. The kind of wrongness that settles into your bones before you have words for it. Then I heard it. A whisper. Came from the walls. Not outside. Not from another room. Inside the walls themselves. At first, I thought it was just settling sounds, echoes in the old ventilation, the way large buildings sometimes creak and shift as they decay. But the whispering didn't stop. It was too deliberate, too constant, never fading, never breaking apart into the randomness of natural sounds. I pressed my ear against the surface. It was a voice. It didn't speak in words I could understand. It was low, rhythmic, almost mechanical. A steady cadence that made my head ache the longer I listened. But it wasn't alone. There were more voices, layered underneath, all speaking at once, all saying something I wasn't supposed to hear. Then, all at once, they stopped. I stepped back, heartbeat hammering against my ribs. The air felt thicker, like the room had closed in around me without moving. I turned toward the door. It wasn't where I had left it. The furniture was the same. The papers scattered across the floor hadn't shifted. But the door was wrong. It was on the opposite side of the room. I left without looking back. I've heard stories like this before. Survivors who took shelter in familiar places only to wake up in rooms that weren't the same as when they had closed their eyes. Walls that moved, hallways that stretched longer than they should, doors that opened to the wrong places. Some have stepped through doorways and found themselves somewhere else entirely. A man traveling through Zone E3 told me he ducked into a basement during a storm, hoping to wait it out. He spent hours down there, watching the water seep through the cracks, counting the time in slow, steady breaths. When the rain finally stopped, he climbed the stairs and opened the door. He wasn't in the building he had entered. He wasn't even in Zone E3. He had stepped out onto a rooftop, looking down at a city that didn't exist anymore. He ran back down the stairs, slamming the door behind him. When he opened it again, it led to the street where he had started. He never found that rooftop again. There are places that shift when we aren't looking, walls that aren't as solid as they seem, rooms that want to trap us inside. If you find yourself in a building that feels wrong, where the doors don't match where they should lead, where the hallways stretch too long, where the walls whisper even when no one is speaking, don't stay the night. There are places where the night doesn't end, not in the way it lingers on the horizon during winter, not in the way thick clouds blot out the sky during storms. Some places have been caught in darkness for days, weeks, maybe longer, and the people who've seen them say the worst part isn't the absence of light, it's what moves inside it. A group of survivors traveling through Zone E5 told me they kept watch on the time, tracking the sky, marking each hour as they walked. They weren't careless. They knew how easy it was to lose time, how fast the world could shift when no one was paying attention. They knew the rules, but the sun never came back. 1 minute, dusk had settled, stretching long shadows across the ruined streets. Then full night took hold and it stayed. They walked through it, expecting dawn to come, expecting even the faintest hint of a rising glow on the horizon. But it never came. Their watches ticked forward. The air grew colder. The stars flickered like dying embers overhead. But morning never arrived. They weren't in a cave. They weren't underground. They weren't somewhere that should have kept the sun from reaching them. But they were trapped in a night that refused to break. On the second day, the sky stopped showing stars. On the third day, they started hearing something moving above them. They never saw what it was. The darkness was too thick, swallowing everything beyond the reach of their flashlights. But they heard footsteps, slow, measured, massive. One of them swore he saw something shifting above them when he pointed his light toward the sky, a shape moving between them and the stars, something enormous, something watching. They ran. Somewhere along the way, they found a break in the darkness. They walked through it without hesitation, pushing forward, refusing to look back. And just like that, the sun was there again, hanging high in the sky as if it had never been missing at all. None of them could explain it. None of them could find their way back to where they had been. But they all had the same dream that night, a dream of something standing in the dark, just beyond the light, waiting for the night to stretch long enough to reach them again. I've heard other stories like this, places where the sun sets and doesn't rise again, places where the moon hangs in the sky like an open eye, unblinking, unmoving, watching the land below, places where even artificial light starts to flicker, dimming, weakening, as if the darkness itself is swallowing it. Some survivors say if you listen closely, you can hear voices in the dark. Not whispers, not echoes, but your own voice calling back to you from somewhere just out of reach. If the sun doesn't rise, if the night doesn't break, if you find yourself in a place where the light never comes back, don't stand still, because something in the dark is waiting for you to stop. Not everyone who disappears stays gone. Some of them come back. Some of them find their way out of whatever space swallowed them, walk out of the places that should have erased them, step back onto roads that should have left them behind. But when they do, they aren't the same. I met a man a few days ago. He was sitting by the remains of a collapsed radio tower, staring at nothing, his hands resting in the dirt like he had forgotten they were attached to his body. He didn't look injured. He didn't look sick, but there was something in the way he held himself. Too still, too careful, like he was waiting for something to catch up with him. I asked him how long he'd been sitting there. He said, "Not long." I asked him where he had come from. He hesitated, then said, "Nowhere important." The words were normal. His voice was not. It was too even, too measured, lacking the ragged edge of exhaustion, the weight of someone who had been surviving for far too long. I asked if he needed food. He said he wasn't hungry. I asked if he needed water. He said he wasn't thirsty. Then I asked him his name. He didn't answer. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Just the shape of the word, the silent movement of his lips, the ghost of something that should have been there but wasn't. I waited. He tried again. Still nothing. Then, after too long, he smiled. Not a real smile. Not the kind that reaches the eyes. Just a slow, deliberate expression. The kind you practice in a mirror when you're trying to remember how it's supposed to look. I left before he could try speaking again. I've heard of others like him. People who went missing in places that shouldn't exist, swallowed up by roads that led nowhere, pulled into buildings that weren't really buildings. Some of them reappear days later. Some of them reappear weeks later. A few have come back after months, unchanged, uniged, unaware that any time has passed at all. They don't remember where they've been. They don't remember how they got back. They don't seem to remember much of anything before they vanished. But the people who knew them say they're wrong. They talk differently. They move differently. They answer questions in ways that don't quite fit, like someone struggling to recall a script they were never meant to read. Some forget simple things, what their favorite food used to be, the names of the people they traveled with, the scars they should have had but don't anymore. Others remember things that never happened. A woman near Zone F6 said she was reunited with her brother after he had been missing for 3 months. He looked the same, spoke the same, but when she mentioned the shelter they had stayed in before he vanished, he laughed and said, "That never happened." She thought he was joking. Then she realized he wasn't. He told her about places they had never been, people they had never met, memories that didn't belong to either of them. And when she pressed him, when she asked him to prove he was still himself, he stopped speaking altogether. She woke up the next morning to find him gone. Survivors say they've seen the ones who return standing alone at night, staring at the sky, unblinking, whispering to themselves in voices just low enough to be mistaken for the wind. Some of them disappear again without a trace. Others stay, pretending to be who they were before. Some of them succeed. Some of them don't. If someone you knew is missing, if they come back after too long, if they don't remember things the way they should, watch them carefully. Because not everyone who returns is the same person who left. The rules we used to know don't hold anymore. Whatever kept the world together before, gravity, time, memory, even the space between places, it's breaking. Maybe it started the moment the first bombs fell. Maybe it started the moment the invaders arrived. Or maybe it started long before that, before we ever realized something had been waiting beneath the surface, watching, waiting for the right moment to pull everything apart. I don't think we're just surviving a war. I don't think this is just an invasion. I think something much larger is happening, something older, something we were never meant to understand. The land is shifting. The sky is unraveling. The places we thought we knew are changing beneath our feet. And the things that shouldn't exist are stepping into the spaces that used to belong to us. I've seen too much to believe in coincidence anymore. The towns that vanish overnight, leaving nothing behind. The roads that refuse to take you where you need to go. The landmarks that come back wrong, like something tried to rebuild them but couldn't remember the details. The voices on the radio, the ones that know your name before you say it. The figures that don't move until you blink. The night that doesn't end. The people who disappear and return as something else. The world is being rewritten. I don't know by who. I don't know by what. I don't know if this is the work of the invaders, or if they're just as caught in it as we are, trying to shape something they can't control. Maybe the war was never about taking the planet. Maybe it was about stopping this from happening. Maybe they lost just like we did. Whatever is happening, it's accelerating. The fractures in the sky are growing. The blank spaces where places used to be are spreading. The whispers in the wires are getting louder. The reflections are getting faster, and the things that are returning to replace what's been lost are looking more and more like us. The old rules don't apply anymore. What you remember may not exist tomorrow. What you trust may not be real. What you think is solid may open up beneath you without warning. And what you think is human may only be pretending. I don't know how much longer this signal will hold. I don't know if I'll still be here to send another broadcast. But as long as the frequency is clear, as long as my voice can reach you, I'll keep talking. Because if you're listening, you're still here. And that means we haven't been erased yet.